Have you ever heard the terms voluntary and involuntary migration? Do you know what they mean? Hi, my name is Melissa Siegel. I'm a professor of migration studies, and this is a channel about all things migration. And today we are going to be talking about voluntary versus involuntary migration, which are terms that are often used in the migration discourse. But first, of course, we should review the definition of a migrant. And a migrant is any person who is moving or has moved across an international border or within a state away from his or her habitual place of residence, regardless of the person's legal status, whether the movement is voluntary or involuntary, what the causes for that movement are, or what the length of stay is. And that is a definition according to the International Organization for Migration. Now, what is a voluntary migrant or an involuntary migrant? So a voluntary migrant is a person who has moved as a result of their own desires and motivations, whereas an involuntary migrant is a person who has migrated because they've been displaced from their home country for a number of different reasons. So forced migration is a migratory movement which, although the drivers can be diverse, involves force, compulsion, or coercion, okay? So we often think about voluntary versus involuntary migration as a kind of dichotomy. So people are either involuntarily migrating or voluntarily migrating. So typical types of voluntary migration that we often discuss are things like migration for family reasons, or for education or retirement, or for jobs or lifestyle, or just better opportunities. Whereas forced migration we usually categorize as things like migration because of conflict, violence, war, persecution, or the environment. Now, while we discuss these things as a dichotomy, it's important to recognize that in practice, things are not so straightforward, and we should probably think about the voluntariness of migration more generally on a continuum, all right? So you can think about the most forced types of migration that we can think today as maybe someone who is kidnapped and then is trafficked across a country border, all right? So here we would see a very, very involuntary, a very forced type of migration. There was no decision making from the beginning to the end, okay? And on the voluntary side, you could think of someone who, let's say like myself, had the opportunity to stay in their own country, to have a good life in their own country. So I'm originally from the United States, and I currently live in the Netherlands. And my decision to migrate was completely voluntary based on my own wishes and desires. Now we can think about a lot of other types of things in between, okay? So think of someone who is in a dangerous area where there is a lot of conflict and violence and war, right? So that person definitely probably feels compelled to move. But at the same time, we do not see that every person in even a war zone has migrated. So there could be a number of different reasons for that, but there is still some kind of decision making that is often coming into play, even within this type of migration that we would often consider very forced. And there is definitely some kind of compulsion and a feeling of need to do this, right? That's usually categorized more on the forced side. So when thinking about the voluntariness of migration, another important aspect to take into consideration is whether or not there are acceptable or reasonable alternatives. So for example, if I am from the United States and I want to go to university somewhere, I have plenty of good universities that I can go to also in the United States. If I then decide to go study in another country, let's say the Netherlands, I had acceptable alternatives for my education, so then that migration would be seen as definitely voluntary. However, if you think about a situation where maybe someone is from a very small country or a small island state where the higher education institutions are not very well developed, maybe what they would like to study in higher education is not even available in that country, then when they think about migrating abroad somewhere for higher education, we can actually ask ourselves whether or not there are acceptable or reasonable alternatives for that person. And if there aren't, then we can also think about, some type of, not complete voluntariness in their decision to migrate, given their life aspirations more generally. So once again, it's really important to understand if there are acceptable alternatives or reasonable alternatives for people to be able to stay. And if that is the case, then their migration is really purely voluntary. But if that's not, then we have to think about some aspects of, involuntariness or not total voluntariness in their migration decision. But now let me ask you another question. What about a person who feels like they have no opportunities in their current place of origin, someone who feels like they cannot feed their family unless they migrate for work somewhere else? Do you think of this person as someone who is forced to migrate or someone who is voluntarily migrating? So in reality, it's not just a dichotomy. In reality, there's much more that actually comes into the decision-making process. And there's often still an element of both voluntariness and involuntariness within a specific decision. So again, what we need to be seeing nowadays is we need to think about the voluntariness of migration, not just as a dichotomy of forced versus voluntary. There is really everything in between. And we know also from other videos that I have on this channel, for example, on the reasons why people migrate, that there are often overlapping reasons why people migrate. Some of them might be more forced or coerced or might be seen as more involuntary, whereas others might be seen as more voluntary. So if you want to know more about that and the different reasons why people migrate, and often how there are multiple reasons why people migrate, of course, you can check out the video here. I'll make sure to link it in the description below. Now, of course, if you found this video useful, do give it a thumbs up. If you haven't done so already, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any videos that we upload on a regular basis on different migration issues. And I hope this helped to clear up a little bit about the conceptualization of voluntary versus forced migration. I definitely hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.